Hi, Divine Masters of the Light. Welcome. So today's video is what specific factors produce the negative ego. So we would suggest here to start putting ego into a new perspective so you can start getting on top of it. So there are some very specific areas, not exclusive areas, but specific areas where the ego tends to develop and has very fertile soil to do so. So the first factor that produces the negative ego is discouraged thinking. The second factor is reluctant to grow up. The third factor is the fear of responsibility and accountability. The fourth factor that you look for the simple way or the quick answer to your question or the quick solution to your problem can lock you into a negative ego. The fifth factor that produces the negative ego is the belief that it really was done to you. The abuse, etc., opens wide the door for the negative ego. So the sixth factor, you don't love or forgive yourself or others. The seventh factor, you create your own reality. And finally, the eighth factor that produces the negative ego is the fear of loneliness. There are several reasons why you're allowing this phenomenon to occur. The formation and development of the negative ego comes about from one or many of the combinations of these eight, or any others. We are just talking about the primary ones. You may have your uniqueness for locking yourself in your negative ego, but these are eight primary reasons that produce the negative ego. We will be discussing this in great detail and why you allowed your ego to become ill, and in its illness becomes negative and destructive. So why did you create it? How did it happen, this phenomenon of illness and isolation? So the first thing that produces the negative ego is when you're afraid to think. No one's afraid to think, right? Well, we would suggest quite otherwise. Most people are afraid to think. Thinking is an incredibly important part of who you are. You have given yourself this magnificent brain. But all those who study tell you in their books and in their literature how magnificent this brain is of yours. If you tried to duplicate it in a mechanical machine, or in a computer, it would take buildings and buildings. Even with your new microchips, it would take buildings to put something together that could even begin to function in the way your brain does. This is your thinking machine, Divine Ones. So some will tell you your brain has a limited capacity, right? That it can only respond or it can only receive data. Well, we would suggest new scientists are telling us what your brain thinks. The research shows that, understanding more clearly of the frontal lobes, that your brain is an active, not passive thinker that is solving the future. It is thinking up the future right now. The capacity of that brain is so very limitedly used. 3%, 5%, 10%, 30%, etc. The figures are so minimal, we don't need to chatter over them. How much you don't even use of what you have available. How much you are afraid of thinking. It's not your fault, truly. You are taught by your parents first of all, don't think. Thinking is dangerously, particularly if those thoughts contradict my own. Therefore, you are, from the time when you were very small, you were encouraged not to think, just do as I tell you, and just do what you're told. I know best. I have thought this out already. And take advantage of my knowledge. Don't think. Okay, so you go to school and you get the same message. Not just in elementary school, but all the way through it. You get the very clear message. Don't think outside the box. Just repeat that which you are told. let me, the professor, do all the thinking for you. Read my book and adhere to it. In college and high school, it's more obvious. Many times, through the insecurity of the teacher, very much so discourages critical thought and instead encourages memory. Therefore, very clearly, your educational system, for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, very much encourages you not to think. The world is happening such that it isn't possible to know all there is to know. That it is no longer possible to get training and become an expert at everything you do. So much in the 1800s and early 1900s, a person could be self-sufficient in a sense, learning all the skills of all the tasks they needed to know, and function very linearly and very happily. But the world is moving too quickly and time is going too fast, but there is still too much to know, and when you look at it, the explosion of knowledge that has occurred in the last even 20 years is incredible, right? The amount of knowledge that was known 100 years ago and the amount of knowledge available to you now are monumental, staggeringly huge, right? Whereas in 1800 you could learn everything there was to know and be an expert at everything now, right? But now you cannot. There's not enough time to do it all, and therefore we encourage the creation of synergistic working in a non-linear reality. Your society as a whole similarly encourages you not to critically think. In fact, rather makes it easy to go insane if you do, with all the doubt, double think, and double talk, and all the strangeness of reality that your government and bureaucratic system creates. It's almost out of self-defense to stop thinking. We can understand that and have some compassion for that. Nonetheless, we would suggest it happens. Your society discourages thought. From the government to religion discourages thinking. Psychology that wants you to be normal. Be like everybody else. Have the average sex drive, have the average intelligence, have the average urges and desires, have the average everything. Be normal and fit in. Don't think or ask questions, okay? Unfortunately, much of metaphysics spirituality is geared similarly. Don't think. Thinking is bad for you. Don't go by your head. Just open your heart and let what you feel happen. Just go by your feelings. Don't think. Don't read and don't put two and two together. Don't follow through on a thought, logic, if that's so old-fashioned. Don't think. Open your heart instead. So the fact that there is just so much to know further discourages thinking. We would suggest your stubbornness of hanging on to the past similarly discourages thinking. To revel in the past is to stay back there and how bad it was and how terrible they really were or how grand and great it really was is indeed discouraging thinking. If you thought about it for 10 minutes, you'd realize, well, that's ridiculous. I can't live in the past and I can't keep holding on to it, good or bad. We would suggest here that thinking is discouraged, and when you don't think, your ego has to. When you refuse to provide the form in the context which provides thinking, the ego supplies the data, and then the ego will also take over the function of putting that data in form, in context. And the ego will creepingly, and not so creepingly, take over and do all your thinking for you. So that you never think, oh, I think a lot. I think about it for a moment. How much do you think? Really, think. Some of you will discover more of yourself, perhaps, more than you would like to believe, right? You would discover if you don't think at all. So you have gone through days, weeks, and some of you even years without critical thinking. Oh, yes, you think of what am I going to have for dinner? Sometimes that is the toughest decision that you have made all day. We are not being cruel in saying that. when you look at that, for some of you, the sadness is true. That the toughest thing you think about is what to eat, where, go, and when. Sure, you think about what to wear and this sort of thing sometimes. Right? So we would suggest, do you think abstract thoughts? Do you think about ideas? What do you think about, concepts, do you think critical? Do you think about and understanding something you don't understand? How much time do you think about thinking? I think that someday I am going to do that when I get some time off, when I'm not so busy, when there are not so many problems, when my life is finally working for me. Then, after I get everything together, then I'll start thinking about concepts and ideas and critical thinking. So how many books are you reading right now where you have to look up words in the dictionary to understand the meaning of the word? To look up the words and to add to your thinking capacity, etc. And indeed, we are not asking for answers, but for you to just think about it, because we would suggest the lack of thinking is one of the easiest ways for the negative ego to take over your life. So we would suggest here that very activity and the fact that there is just so much to know further discourages thinking. How many of you have read school books fully in detail, classic novels, or that new topic you wanted to study? I was meant to get to that when I was 12, and maybe by 15 years old, then I better just read it, just for the sake of reading it. By the time I'm 18, after the summer, after high school, I will finally get around maybe to reading that classic novel, but you never did. Now you're 30 or 40 or 50, and you're never going to go back to read those, and we would not encourage you to do so, because you see, it's an analogy of what we're talking about. How much knowledge did you miss? Now, there's just so much more that you just can't possibly go back and think of it all. You can't possibly, and that's it. It's not like you are a bunch of dummies or you are stupid people. You should be ashamed of yourself for not thinking. No. But understand the dynamics, that there is so much more knowledge to think about. Now that sometimes it is staggering that it seems sitting down and thinking for an hour has got to be just a little scratch in the amount of knowledge there is to think about. And it's not worth it. It's a totally important function, and therefore most of you don't do it. Therefore, we say 50 to hundreds of years ago was not as big of a problem as it is now. A negative ego was not the biggest problem as it is now. There was a negative ego, but not as severe as now. There was always been a negative ego, and a negative ego promised and never delivered. But we would suggest the ego is more of a problem now than it was in the 1960s. It was more of a problem in the 1960s than it was in the 1940s and the 1920s, because there is less thinking going on now. And that's one of the biggest reasons, is less thinking. In the higher 2050, it'll be more so. You have negative ego problems, right? Well, wait 10 more years, they will be worse. Yours will be worse as well as those coming up. So the ego is getting worse. It's getting epidemic or whatever. It's not to blame you, nor should you feel blame or self-blaming, but to appreciate the world you have created, where knowledge is being reproduced geometrically, and where you are trying to think and function arithmetically. You are fighting a losing battle. You can counter it and you can come around the other way, but that's where your negative ego gets its first big foothold and jumps into place, because no one is doing the form and context, and so it takes over that function. So the development of the negative ego is fertilized most by the fact that you don't think, and it's not your fault. But to understand your society, to understand the messages that are repeatedly put out to you with television and movies and with home entertainment. Perhaps a new phrase more appropriate, home entertainment, be it video games or whatever. There is less and less need to think. We will do it for you, and you know all the psychological stuff is about all the kids growing up with television and a babysitter by the boob tube that has developed. Nonetheless, when all the confetti falls to the ground, it is still left with the idea that indeed it doesn't encourage thinking. In fact, the TV does all the thinking for you. So therefore, the first thing to understand, your own refusal and your own fear of thinking, is what has given leeway and room for the negative ego to expand, to become warped, become sick, lay wide and lay you vulnerable for the negative ego to gobble you up. Now, the second thing that produces negative ego is the fact that people are reluctant to grow up, and the fear and refusal to let go of the past and move into your adulthood. So the point is, if you're afraid to grow up, you won't grow up, right? How many of you between your 30s and your 50-year-old revel up the fact that you don't feel 30 or 50? How do you know what it feels like to be 35 unless you have done it before in this lifetime? Since you haven't, you don't really know what it is, and therefore, in that particular sense, how many of you marvel at the fact that you still feel 18? Are you still feeling 18, or are you still an adolescent? We would suggest here, more likely, the answer is the latter. So those of you who find the fondest days were high school and senior year of high school, oh, how I'll long for it, or how college, that's even a bigger trap, because at college they play in an adult mode more than they do in high school. You get to wear ties and suits and coats, and you get to wear heels and nylons and are more accepted. Whereas in high school, where are you going? To job interviews. What you going? You got an appointment somewhere out there in the real world? Why do you dress like this? Right? Those that find the fondest days were either high school or college, pretty sure, unless that was the last year, that you are probably not grown up. You're not accepting the fact that this is it, folks. This is your adult. This is your adulthood. This is your real life. Honestly, it may be an illusion, but it's the only one you got. At least at this time, you're aware of it. Think about that. How many of you in your 50s remember the good old days? The Saturday football, or the endless summers, right? No responsibility, or your friends getting together and having the time of your life. The fond days, 30 years ago or 40 years ago. How many of you think, the 60s were just a few years back, 5 or 6 years ago? It was the 60s. No, it was 40 years ago. Gee, it feels just like yesterday. That's not senility. That's like trying to hold on to what it is. You're trying to make the 1960s just like yesterday. Some may have lived and died in that time. I'm not going to let go of my fantasy. This is where the adolescent comes in. The fantasy of the adolescent. Someday I'm going to be great. Someday I'm going to be recognized. Someday everything will be in my favor. And someday the world will finally realize how important I am. I have a fantasy in there. An adolescent who knew how not to get along in the world, was terrified of the world, and therefore cushioned himself or herself with fantasy. And I still want to hold on to that, or holding on to any fantasy to cushion my hard life. I still want to believe that somehow the fantasy is going to come true. So I don't want to grow up yet. I'll chronologically move from one year to the next, maybe for a while, but I don't want to grow up yet. I want to start over, if anything, but I don't want to grow up. My parents, they didn't love me enough, and they didn't take care of my past, really. They screwed my life up, and neglect and abandonment and abuse was really did cause me to be the way I am. I'm not done blaming it. I'm not done pointing a finger. I'm not willing to let off the hook just yet. I am not done with the past. Not until I am heard to explain my limitations, to explain my inability to, I still want to look at it, and I still want to look at it too. Do you understand me? You never understand me. So the child within me still has not gotten enough love, and I am not budging until I do, until they pay the debt for the love I never got, until society makes it up to me, and until Goddess fixes me. I'm not going to let go of the past. The point is, if you're afraid to grow up, you won't grow up. Very clearly, that's fertile soil for the ego to take over. Fear and refusal to give up on what you are holding on to. A lot of it is just that, your age, you are not a kid anymore, or an 18-year-old. You're getting older every day, but where is your mind? Is it still stuck at 18, or is it stuck at 21? To hang on to that is another way of saying, I don't want to grow up. Very clearly, the world is a more complicated place now. It is more complicated than ever was, and it was easier to be a grown-up in the early 1900s than it is to be a grown-up now, but that doesn't provide an excuse for not doing it. Nonetheless, it was easier, but there were other difficulties. Electricity wasn't so good, no television or video, no Dolby Sound and things like that, right? The trade-off is maybe not worth it. The quality of life is better, but more difficult. For your quality of life is better now than it was then. We would suggest here that may be the trade-off, but that doesn't make it all right to not grow up. Because, you see, your ego will still take over if you refuse to grow up. If you want to think of yourself as still being a kid or a teenager when you're an adult, one person just turned 30 and said, my gosh, I am no longer a teenager. Refusal to grow up makes fertile soil for a negative ego to grow strong in. This is because your ego is supposed to deliver you the content, but I am not dealing with the form or context, and therefore ego must, and therefore it becomes negative, and therefore it becomes destructive, because I won't grow up and I won't be the adult that I knew I could be. Therefore, as I hold to my child, hold to my adolescent, hold to my past, refuse to be an adult, and refuse to stretch into the future, so I make fertile soil for my negative ego to grow strong in. Okay? Okay, so the third factor that produces a negative ego is refusal and fear. Once again, fear and refusal to be responsible. You see, you have this stigma attached to the responsibility that somehow it's a bad thing and somehow it's a terrible thing, rather than realizing that, wait a moment, responsibility is my freedom. Because you see, I have heard responsibility, and I have linked it to blame. Okay, I'll admit it. I'm responsible. I'll take the flake. I'll take the heat. I'm the one at fault. I'll take the blame. I've been so associated with the responsibility that when the word mentions, all right, who is responsible for this? Okay, you see, that's true. A lot of the responsibility that people have to take initially is pretty negative stuff. That's true. The pain, the ugliness, the hurt, the destructiveness, that is in your life. To be responsible for that, indeed, is where responsibility begins. So admittedly, the first of it looks pretty negative. In the first look, it looks pretty difficult. But once you get past that initial responsibility, the pain, the hurt, the destructiveness, then there is the responsibility, but who is responsible for all this joy? Who brought about all this happiness? Where did all this success come from? Now I'll be responsible. Joyously. But you see, you have this stigma attached to the responsibility that somehow it's a bad thing. And somehow it's a terrible thing. Rather than realizing that, wait a moment, responsibility is my freedom. Yeah. What if it is really true that your mother did it to you? What if it is true that the ex-spouse who hates you now is the one who is responsible? What if it is true that your boss who fired you is really the one responsible for the fact that you cannot hold a decent job? What if that were true? The initial is, it is not my fault, not my responsibility. Yeah, but wait a minute. I have to get that mother who's no more to fix it, right? I have to get that ex-spouse that hates me terribly to come back to fix it. I got to get that ex-boss who won't even give me a letter of recommendation to fix it. I'm in a pickle. I'm in a really tough situation where if I am the one responsible, then I don't have to find a mother to fix it. I don't have to find that ex-spouse. I don't have to find that ex-boss. Therefore, responsibility is liberation. You have heard that, but still, when it comes to who is responsible, there's a tendency to cringe and to curl up and pretend it's not me, rather than to be out there, yes, I am responsible because I am responsible. I can change it. I can fix it. But the refusal to be responsible, the refusal to be held accountable for your failures, yes, and for your success. You think if you know successful responsibility, you would take it. And we would suggest many of you would not. It scares you just as much. So who brought about this success? Who brought about this wonderful reality? I did. And you might expect it from me again. How many of you wish you could have gotten A's in school? But when you did, were terrified because now you have to keep it up. Because you see, if you get a C, then you can do it better. But if you get an A, you better keep doing it. You know? If you are mediocre, succeed, then there is always room for improvement. But if you are creating an excellent reality, then people expect you to continue that excellence. So positive responsibility scares you. It feels like I am like a hampering, feels like a weight upon you because you believe it, because you are afraid of it. After all, you refuse to take it. And that refusal to be accountable and responsible has left the door wide open for your negative ego to gobble up that responsibility. I'll take it. I'll take it. A fourth factor that produces the negative ego is that you look for the simple way or the quick answer to your question or the quick solution to your problem. So you want life to be so simple, and you want all the answers to be black and white truths, and platitudes. And when you do that, you leave the door wide open for the negative ego to violence. Okay? So when is a past lifetime an influence, or when is it controlling? Oh, let's just say everything is caught by past lifetimes and forget it. It's a much easier solution. Something is wrong with my past life. Well, there is no past life for me. Simple. How do we handle these things? Right? How do we handle the problems we have to deal with? Oh, I don't want to have a lot of things to do. Let's just say we turn around 3 times and say, razzmatazz, and they are gone. Okay, let's create a simple little solution to our problems. Let me just touch on your head and say your negative ego is gone. Poof, simple. Let me just hug you and tell you there, and I will have taken all your karma. Let me tell you, I'll fix it sometime or another. I'll send somebody to take care of that problem. Don't bother me with trying to tell me how, when, or why this came together. Don't complicate it. Just, I'll fix it. Don't worry about it. Let's just give up our obligations and responsibilities. Let's just throw it all away and be like little children in the sandbox of the world. Simple little answers that appeal to the simple little mind and make massive room for a very complex negative ego to take over. Therefore, when you look at life to be so simple, you can expect it also to be very, very, very long in lifetimes. Not necessarily on its own, but in lifetimes, because those who are telling you, oh, it's so simple, all you have to do is say I love you, or just love. All you have to do is forgive 1,000 times, and all you have to do is just do the will of God, Goddess. In this life, you will look around and say, what did I learn? What did I accomplish? Where did you go with your ego? No one is left to blame you. Now, you'll have to take the consequences of that short-term simplicity against the long-term of multiplicity of lifetimes. That will take you to learn what you could have learned if you had been willing to look for the ease and the intricacies of life. You see, life is very intricate, and that's its beauty. Life is very intricate, it's complex, it's not complicated, but complex and intricate, and each system and each situation has its own unique set of circumstances that must be dealt with uniquely and individually. Why you are limited and why you are totally different and cannot be can't be just put in a category across the board. Life is intricate, and if you are willing to handle the intricacies and the complexities of life, the number of your lifetimes can be substantially less. Life is easy. It has a great deal of ease. It is intricate, it is complex, it has ease, but when you look for the simple answer, the platitudes, the black and white and the absolutes, you'll find them. But you will have a multiplicity of lifetimes and a massive ego to deal with it. It's a refusal to look for the intricacy and your insistence upon a platitude of simplicities that has opened the door to the negative ego. A part of it is you don't want to think critically, grow up and be responsible, but nonetheless, we would suggest here is you look for the simple answer, the quickie, and that puts it all in place, right? We would suggest very clearly, though, that looking for simplicity as a way out, as a cop-out, is another very wide and open door for the ego to step right in and take over. Try not to look for the quick fix, analyze, think critically, and formulate deep thoughts when finding solutions. The fifth factor that produces a negative ego is the belief that it really was done to you. The abuse, etc., opens wide the door for the negative ego. Whatever it is, they really did do this to me. I hear what you're saying, Chris, but I am the exception. They really did do me wrong. They really did treat me badly. They really did, honest to God, Goddess, they did. My assistance is holding to that opens wide the door for the negative ego to take over more and more, to give it the responsibility that I should be taking for myself. Also, the feeling of under-deserving, refusing to realize you do deserve because you are, not because you are anything, but just because you are. The refusal to love yourself and the refusal to forgive yourself has a lot to do with where that negative ego grows and becomes infected with its own illness. We would suggest your refusal to be all that you can be, holding an idea that you are somehow the sludge of the universe, that you're somehow the garbage. Everywhere else are all these advanced spiritual beings just waiting to get together, refusing to accept your value, refusing to accept and value your humanness, and refusing to let yourself be all that you are, and instead living life as an apology rather than as a celebration. The sixth thing that produces a negative ego are when you don't love yourself or others, and when you won't forgive yourself or won't forgive others. Walk around bitter all the time. You're tilling the soil for sure to plant a very rigid and powerful ego. The lack of self-love and forgiveness and the lack of love and forgiveness for others opens the door wide for the negative ego to dig in deep and devour you. But that is exactly what it does. It eats out your insides and devours you first, your brain, and then the rest of you until you are nothing but a hollow shell. We would suggest here that you know people who are like that. I do. Who is so into their negative ego that they are no longer functioning in this reality. They are nothing but a shell that is living in a grand illusion that someday I'm going to be rich and famous, and someday I'm going to be someone important. Right? All wrapped up into one. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to be everybody and everything. I'm going to be the leader of the new age or whatever. Right? You see it, and you click your tongue. Oh, wonder what happened to them. They were eaten alive by their negative ego, just as you're being eaten alive by your ego. There may be a more advanced case. Oh, that will never happen to me, said the ego. When you're playing hopscotch patty cake, right, or baker's man with your negative ego, just know your negative ego is playing for keeps. Not loving and forgiving yourself, forgive and love all your experiences, for you are in the great school of life, to love, to grow, to experience all that you are. Release negative ego by loving and forgiving yourself and others. The seventh factor that produces the negative ego is not really wanting to accept the fact that it is your reality that you are creating. Here you are, brought up. That reality happens to you, and that you have no control over your reality. You create your own reality, period. The best you can do is get the best education, study as hard as you can, and get to know the best people you can, and try, and take a deep breath, and make an end run and hope you make it. And it's all a matter of luck after that. But the reality is solid and real, and really out there, and you are powerless against it unless you can somehow craft a trick it or sneak through in the middle of the night or whatever. Then you come along, all of you come along on a path of growth, the path of spirituality, where you wouldn't have got involved in metaphysics indeed. There are a lot more that don't get involved and do it. But you came along and said, no, there is something else I know there is. I know that can't be right. That I don't have to sneak through life. I don't have to be powerless pawn of reality. You discover that you create your own reality first as a thought out here somewhere. And to many of you, it's like clear music and the very first time, and probably can't even remember the very first time you ever heard it. You create your own reality. To many of you, it's just a bell. It was like a clear bell that just made it sit up and tingle, and you didn't know why. To others of you, it was an intriguing thought that would be nice if it was true and deserving of more investigation. For others of you, you didn't know why, but somehow it attracted you. That concept, wherever you heard it or read it, it's not that it has been new, it has been said forever. But then you get into a position where you don't believe it. You get into a position where it's a theory that would be nice, a philosophy to live by, if you ever get. Well, as soon as I get the rest of my life straightened out, then I'll start living by that philosophy that I create my own reality. But I don't have time now. There are too many problems. I'm in survival mode right now. Many of you say the words and don't believe it. Many of you don't want to believe it. Many of you want to pretend reality is really there. That your problems are real. That they really did do that to you. It really did happen. And it really was awful. And was really debilitating. Honest. I see yours was just an illusion, something you created as an excuse, but mine was really real. I got the scars to prove it, and that opens the door wide for the negative ego. No, I don't create my reality. Life is unfair. Poor me. So you create your own reality. And if you think, hey, I don't create my own reality, it's happening to me, right? Therefore, opens wide for the ego to take over to violence. For so many we have talked with, the impact is so very large, and seems like many who are indeed into growth and spirituality, honestly, earnestly, and beautifully, and get hooked up in the idea that it's somehow bigger than them. We hear the stories about the evil forces who are after me because of the knowledge I have, and the dark forces are out to destroy me because of the wonderment and beauty of the knowledge I have. If the world would understand it, why the dark forces are doomed, and so they are out to get me. These we are hearing from people with total earnestness, and it's sad. It's sad to see someone weed out like that, totally flipped out and gone, perhaps for a lifetime. It is really sad to see this shell of nothing occupied totally by ego. We would suggest we hear that, not frequently, as we said, but it has such an impact. I know I create my own reality, and the forces that are stronger, bigger, and more powerful than me are telling me this and that and the other, and I am their agent and servant and this sort of thing. It's sad. I have surrendered myself to whatever. We would suggest here, in this regard, the human potential movement, unfortunately, has had its hand in up to the elbow, most definitely, in encouraging that sort of thing. If you believe and don't know that you create your own reality, you're creating very fertile soil for the ego to take over. No, I did not create my negative ego. Yes, you did. It's important to understand you do create your own reality, and you did create your own negative ego. And you may have not have wanted to, but you did do it. You see, your negative ego didn't really begin as this monster out to devour you. It did begin as this psychopath that is somehow hiding out as a personality under your bed, of your personality or whatever. Your ego begins as an assistant. Then you gave it more than it could do. You gave it everything to do until it was isolated, until it became sick, and until it became negative. Well, many would stop there, and say, you get what you deserve. Your negative ego attacks you, then you get what is coming to you. You see, that is not how spirituality works. That is not how metaphysics works. And hopefully, it isn't how your human potential works. At the very least, it's important to understand you did create your own reality, and you did create your own negative ego, and you may have not wanted to, but you did do it. And once you did, you couldn't admit you were wrong. You wouldn't admit you made a mistake, and therefore you somehow said, this is the way it is supposed to be. This is the conditioned called human. This is the way everybody has it. We all must suffer our negative ego, rather than saying, wait a moment, I create this, and I can change this. They say, look, I could not have created my own reality because no one in their friggin' right mind would create a negative ego. Come on. So what you have done is you've created an assistant, an ego, an aspect of your personality. Many who say you do not create your own reality, or they want to say they did not create theirs, ironically use the existence of the negative ego in an attempt to prove that. So perhaps the place to begin is to look at the creation and development of ego, specifically the negative ego. Do you say you have created your own reality? including yourself. You are a ball of energy and you are a spark of light. And at one point decided you wanted to grow, and in that decision to grow, you decided you did want to grow physically. And in that decision to do so, you declared and answered for yourself several questions, and ultimately deciding that the earth plane would be a good place to create your own reality and a good place to play. You all created the earth and you all put it into a solar system, into a galaxy, and into a universe amongst billions of universes. And then you placed yourself into the earth. Now, you did not just pop in as a fully sophisticated human being, clearly not. You first made an entry in the mineral kingdom, and then once you experienced what it was in that kingdom, for whatever time length that felt necessary, you then moved into the plant kingdom, experiencing that as long as you felt necessary to experience that kingdom. You then moved into the animal kingdom, and that is where reincarnation, or that experience of multiple lifetimes, begins. From there, after evolving and sophisticating yourself efficiently, you then moved into the human kingdom at a primitive level. But by the time you reach the human kingdom, this reality you created is getting a little out of hand, and it's a little more complicated than you thought it would be. You see, it's a little more intricate to be a human being than it is to be a piece of quartz. A little more intricate than your favorite flower, for that matter. Even that of the animal kingdom is more sophisticated, admittedly, and more complicated, admittedly. But the human kingdom takes all the cake for complication. So what you have done is you have created an assistant, an ego, an aspect of your personality, and therefore each ego is different, as is each personality. You created an aspect of this personality to serve you, to be a servant, and to assist you to be an assistant, right? You assigned it the task of bringing to you data to let you know that's happening in this world of yours. So you could then take the data and make the kind of decision you wanted to make about the data, then deliver that decision via the ego to your reality. We'd like to suggest that as far as your physical world is concerned, it is the ego that deals with the content, delivering it, and then responding to it. And it is the conscious mind that determines the form and the context the content will be in. Now that's how your physical world operates. Now the eighth thing that produces negative ego is the fear of loneliness. If you're afraid to be alone, you will lock into the negative ego. One of the most invisible and insidious forms that opens the door to the ego is the fear of loneliness. For truly so, when you fear being lonely and can't stand your own company, you will always have company. You always have someone around you or talking to you. Always have somebody telling you how wonderful and terrible you are. But at least somebody is communicating with you. When you have a fear of loneliness, you fear being by yourself, alone, with your thoughts, feelings, pain, etc. Fear of loneliness is one of the big avenues that allow in the ego and let it get entrenched and locked in, Therefore, the formation and the development of the negative ego come about from one of many of the combinations of these 8 that we've discussed today, or any others. We are just talking about the primary ones. You may have your own uniqueness for locking yourself in your negative ego. But these 8 primary reasons. Number 1, discouraged thinking. Number 2, reluctant to grow up. Number 3, the fear of responsibility and accountability. Number 4, that you look for the simple way or the quick answer to your questions, or the quick solution to your problem can lock you into your negative ego. Number 5 is a belief that it really was done to you, the abuse, right, etc. opens wide the door for the negative ego. 6, you don't love or forgive yourself or others. 7, you create your own reality. And number 8, fear of loneliness. Those are the primary components that open the door to allow that negative ego to function, to allow that negative ego to grow in its sickness, its isolation, until it's become a sick negative ego and has become the enemy until it starts attacking you. For once the negative ego has gathered its power in its sickness, it is not going to admit it. It's not going to back down. It's not going to turn it over. Once you have given it the position of the chairman of the board, you can't just walk in and say, okay, thanks much. It's running the show and it can't admit it. Doesn't know what it's doing. It can't admit that. It's totally lost and totally sick, and so therefore it sustains itself. To maintain itself, you must go. Yeah, so in the comments below, just let me know what other components or factors you think create the negative ego. I'd love to hear about them. And yeah, thanks for listening to me today, and blessings, Divine Warriors of the Light.